Welcome to Beat Diabetes. We're coming to you all the way from France today. Okay, not really, but I am responding to a comment left by an individual. I believe it was a man. I can't remember for sure. We'll call him a he, who is from France. And so let me read his comment, and then we want to take it apart point by point and respond to it a bit. It's not all negative. I'm not here to slam him. He makes some good points and some things with which I would disagree somewhat. So anyway, here's his comment. I watched your video with potatoes and pasta. As you are very low carb all year long, you lose your ability to handle high carb meals. If you could do the same testing after 3 or 4 days, getting 100 grams of carbs daily, you'd see very different numbers. Keto and low carb, the keto and the low carb trick is that it is too rich in calories. 1 gram of fat gives 9 calories. 1 gram of carb gives 4 calories. So keto and low carb tend to eat too many calories and fatten liver and pancreas. In my mind, people in the gray zone should eat moderate to low carb. It's better to see a rise of 135 milligrams per deciliter with moderate carbs and keep the body pumping insulin than to fear to go over 120 and eat fat and protein, losing the ability to produce insulin. Recent studies show that very healthy adults are having high spikes of insulin just after eating, and that keeps them under 120 to 130 whatever they eat. Insulin is not evil. Losing weight is the biggest factor. So he says a number of things within that reasonably short paragraph, and I just wanted to respond a bit to some of the things he says. Let's start with the beginning, which is always a great place to start, right? He says, as you are very low carb all year long, you lose your ability to handle high carb meals. So he's saying, I watched you test yourself after eating a high carb meal. You went high, but that's to be expected. You eat low carb all year long, so when you do eat high carb, you don't have the ability to process carbs. All right, so let's take that statement, you lose your ability to handle high carb meals. I wouldn't really put it that way. I would say you temporarily decrease your ability to handle high carb meals. Your body does have a memory, so if you're eating low carb, low carb, low carb, week after week, month after month, and then you finally switch to a high carb meal, you may well spike higher than you would if you were used to a higher carb meal. I'll grant you that. But it's not like you lose the ability to handle carbs. It's just your body gets in the rhythm of low carb, and it gets shocked when you eat a high carb meal, and it may overreact. All right, next point, he says keto and low carb, he calls it a trick. I say he's really saying that the problem with that is it's too rich in calories. A gram of fat has a lot more calories than a gram of carb. He's right. And so he says with keto and low carb, you tend to eat too many calories and you get liver fat and pancreas fat. Now that I entirely disagree with. Not the first part. He's right about the calories. Fat does have more calories than carbs do. And so the logic should say if you eat more fatty foods, you're going to take in more calories, you're going to gain weight. Logic should say that. But experience teaches the exact opposite. We hear from hundreds and thousands of people that went low carb, went off that high carbohydrate diet, went to low carb, and yes, fat does have a lot more calories. And yet when they go to a high-fat diet, they lose weight. Why is that? Well, a couple of reasons. Number one, fat does not provoke insulin surges, and insulin is a fat storage hormone. So if you've got more insulin going on in your body, you're going to gain more weight, even if you're eating less calories. So that's one issue. And the other issue is if you're eating more fat, you're going to get filled up so much sooner than you would if you eat carbs. Carbs you can just eat all day long, and you're never really satisfied, and give yourself about 3 hours and you're hungry again. But you can eat a big fatty steak and you may be good for almost all day long. So yes, fat does have more calories than carbs do, but because it satiates you so very well, you end up not eating as much and you end up losing weight rather than gaining. I mean, we hear from people all the time. Not only do they lose weight on a high-fat diet, they weren't even trying to lose weight. It was like a bonus. They were just trying to get their blood sugar in order, and they went high-fat, moderate protein, low-carb, and to their surprise, I dropped 20 pounds, I dropped 50 pounds, I dropped 80 pounds, I dropped 100 pounds. We hear that all the time. It almost could get boring if it weren't so exciting. And I love to hear it. So this theory, and part of it's not theory, part of it's truth, and that is that fat has more calories than carbs. But the theory that if you therefore eat a high-fat diet, you'll gain weight, exactly wrong. And experience teaches that again and again and again. The next thing he says is, in my mind, people in the gray zone should eat moderate to low carb. Low carb works for almost every type 2 diabetic and will bring you down below the 6.5 standard for diabetes. For nearly everybody, I won't say everybody, but for nearly everybody. Type 1s, obviously, you got to take insulin. But still, low carb will help you because you won't have to take so much insulin. Moderate carbs, they could work for a lot of people if they are, number one, slim, and number two, they've never crossed over the boundary into diabetes. There's something about when you cross that boundary that even though you can get back and you can get your numbers down and your numbers can be almost normal, yet you've been weakened by your time in the land of diabetes. And moderate carb probably is not going to work for you. You're probably going to have to be low carb. But there's a difference between low carb and really, really low carb. So 70 grams of carbs per day is what I would call low carb. It's not extremely low carb, but it's low carb compared to what almost every American, most people are eating. So if you're used to 300 grams of carbs per day and you cut it down to about 70, you've done yourself an enormous favor. But for some, that won't be enough. I'd call 70 to 100 grams per day sort of moderate carbs. Anything over 150 is ridiculously high. But a moderate carb could work for some, and it does work for some. There are people who eat moderate carbs and they live to be 100 years old, and they're slim, and their A1C is nearly perfect. So I'm not going to say moderate carb cannot work for anybody. It can, for sure. But for people who are getting older and they've been over that boundary, you've been diagnosed as diabetic. Number one, when you make your way back, you better get it to low carb. And number two, even after you get back, you may not be able to function well and process carbs very well to where moderate carb works. Now, another statement he makes, it's better to see a rise of 135 milligrams per deciliter with moderate carb and keep the body pumping insulin than to fear to go over 120 and eat fat and protein, losing the ability to produce insulin. Well, number one, I don't like that statement, you lose the ability to produce insulin. You don't. By cutting your carbs. If anything, you will gain more ability to produce insulin. It's just that you won't need to produce very much. So the idea that if I cut my carbs way down, I'll no longer be able to function and produce insulin, well, that's absurd. In fact, the problem for most type 2 diabetics is you've got too much insulin production going on. And you need to cool it with that and cut your carbs. You're not going to lose the ability to produce insulin at all. Then he talks about a rise up to 135 with moderate carb is really superior to a fear of going over 120. Well, I would say this, how far you want to let your glucose peaks go is a personal decision. It's not my job, nor really is it any doctor's job to tell you don't let it get above so-and-so, as long as you're keeping it under 140. In other words, if your goal is, I don't want to go higher than 135, and some other diabetic's goal is, I don't want to go higher than 120, once you get things down and under control, then that's your decision. You got to live with that. It's just like the A1C score. Where do you want to land on the A1C? Some people, their whole attitude and objective and goal is, I just want to be in the fives. If I can be 5.9, I'll be so happy. And most of the time, if you've been way up there, and you get into the fives as an A1C, you will be a happy camper. So, and there's others that are like, no, I don't want to be pre-diabetic at all. I don't want to be 5.9. I don't want to be 5.8. I want to be 5.6 or less. Maybe the mid-5s. 5.5 would be a good target for me. And some people, they're like, well, I don't even want to be there. You're going to have to make that decision. You got to live with the consequences. So, and the reality is we're all going to eat. I mean, almost everybody's going to eat fat and protein and carbohydrate, the three macronutrients. We will all eat those. I mean, the closest you'll get to never eating any carbs will be the carnivore diet, if that's your choice. And even with that, most packaged meats you buy are going to have a little bit of sugar added, so it's not like you're getting zero carbs, but you're getting it really, really low. So the question is the proportions. And for a long time, the powers that be in the world of nutrition have said, when it comes to the proportions of your diet, carbs should take up the majority. And as a consequence of that kind of advice, we have obesity, diabetes, heart attacks, strokes, incredible misery in our latter years. And it's just been over the last 20 years or so. Someone has said the emperor has no clothes on. That's ridiculous advice, that we should major on carbohydrates. If they were all healthy carbs, that would be better. But there's no studies that can really indicate that eating fat and protein are unhealthy for you. In fact, the studies are showing the opposite. Another thought that I wanted to leave is processed foods. A lot of people really bash processed foods, and rightly so, but a lot of times we don't realize the biggest problem with them is that processed foods are generally processed carbs. Let me say that again. Processed foods are normally processed carbs. Yeah, you can process meat and make it into beef jerky. That's processed meat, I guess. But if you go into the middle part of the store and see all the boxes and all the processed foods, what are you seeing? You're seeing things like chips and breakfast cereal and pastries and all kinds of garbage. You're just seeing junk. And it's all high-carb foods. So when people say if you can just get rid of the processed foods, you're going to be in good shape, there's truth to that. But the big reason for the fact that eliminate processed foods and you do so much better is that almost all of those processed foods are processed carbs. And when you eliminate that, you cut your carbs way down. There is one basic truth we need to understand, especially if you're even getting close to diabetes. And that truth is this: as we age, we lose some ability, or sometimes a lot of ability, to process carbs. It comes with age. Some people lose more than others. Some people can, at the age of 70 and 80 years old, still eat a moderate carb diet and be just fine. Typically, they're the skinny people, the slim people. But as you age, you lose certain abilities, a lot of abilities. You don't see as well, you don't hear as well, you don't run as fast, you don't think as sharply. You forget things. There's a lot of issues with age, and there's no pill to take, there's no magic button to press to stop that. And you just have to adapt. And so when you get to a certain age, you may need to make lists just because you can't remember things that you maybe could have remembered when you were in your 20s. And one of the adaptations has to do with what you eat. You just can't process carbs like you could. You're going to gain weight easier than you could when you're in your 20s. In fact, I'll go you one better than that. I can't eat the way I did when I was in my 50s. I just can't do it. If I ate the way I did when I was 52 years old, I'd blow up. So you got to make changes. It's called adaptation. And part of the changes is you've got to lower the carbohydrates in your diet. What you could get away with at 22, you cannot get away with at 52, and even less so at 72. Adapt. That's not such an evil word. That's not such a miserable concept. It's part of life. It's like you get older, you have to wear glasses. You may need a hearing aid. There are various adaptations, and no matter how many creams and lotions you use, you're not going to look as good. You just adapt. Some things you accept, some things you can change, And with your diet, you just can't eat the same amount of carbs. One of the questions I've heard frequently is, how in the world did you and Benedicta meet? This question is fully answered in Benedicta's autobiography titled When Destiny Calls. Ben's story is fascinating, and the details of how we were brought together and the events in each of our lives in the years just previous to us coming together will amaze you. The story of our union has romance, drama, and a touch of the miraculous. Order Benedicta's autobiography and be prepared to be inspired and fascinated at how God brings His children together in His way and in His time.